In a quiet little neighborhood where the streets were lined with perfectly trimmed hedges and freshly painted mailboxes, life moved at a slow, predictable pace. The kind of place where kids rode their bikes down the cul-de-sac and neighbors waved hello from across the street. It was the kind of community that seemed like it belonged on a postcard, picturesque, orderly, and peaceful. Officer Mark Reynolds called this suburban haven his home. To his neighbors, he was just another friendly face who kept to himself and always had a polite nod for anyone who crossed his path. What they didn't know was that beneath his calm demeanor lay years of experience as a decorated police officer. Mark loved living in the neighborhood. He appreciated how everyone took pride in maintaining their homes, and he enjoyed being part of a tight-knit community. But there was one thing about the area that sometimes grated on him: the Homeowners Association, HOA. While most people followed the HOA guidelines without issue, there were always a few individuals who took things too far. These were the types who patrolled the streets with clipboards, ready to pounce on anyone daring enough to leave a trash can out overnight or plant flowers outside the approved color palette. And among these self-appointed enforcers, no one stood out more than Karen Miller. Karen was infamous in the neighborhood. She had earned herself the nickname HOA Karen long before such terms became popular online. With her clipboard perpetually tucked under one arm and a permanent scowl etched onto her face, Karen made it her personal mission to ensure every resident adhered strictly to the HOA rules. Whether it was reporting someone for having an unkempt lawn or sending strongly worded letters about holiday decorations left up past January 1st, Karen thrived on finding fault with others. Most residents avoided crossing paths with her whenever possible, knowing full well that even the smallest infraction could result in a lecture, or worse, a formal complaint filed with the HOA board. On this particular sunny afternoon, Mark returned home after finishing his shift at the police station. His day had been long but uneventful, and all he wanted was to relax in the comfort of his own home. As he pulled into his driveway, however, he noticed something unusual. A construction crew was hard at work repairing cracks in his driveway, leaving barely enough space for his car to fit. Not wanting to disrupt their progress, Mark decided to park along the curb instead. It wasn't ideal, but it wasn't a problem either. His car wasn't blocking any driveways, sidewalks, or fire hydrants. In fact, it was parked neatly within the designated street parking lines, fully compliant with city regulations. Satisfied with his decision, Mark grabbed his bag and headed inside, thinking nothing more of it. Little did Mark know, his simple act of parking would soon become the center of attention. Across the street, Karen happened to glance out her window and spotted Mark's car. Her eyes narrowed instantly. To Karen, anything out of the ordinary, even something as minor as a car parked temporarily on the curb, was grounds for scrutiny. Without wasting a moment, she marched outside, clipboard in hand, muttering under her breath about how some people simply couldn't follow basic rules. Determined to document the supposed violation, Karen snapped several photos of Mark's vehicle, jotting down notes in her usual dramatic fashion. Karen's next move was classic Karen. She rummaged through her collection of pre-written forms, templates. She'd created herself, complete with official-sounding language, and filled out what she referred to as a violation notice. On it, she wrote, "Improper parking, fine $500, pay immediately or face further action." Then, with a flourish, she slipped the paper under Mark's windshield wiper. Confident in her authority, Karen stood back to admire her handiwork. To her, this was justice served. After all, rules were rules, and if people couldn't be bothered to follow them, they deserved to face the consequences. Unbeknownst to Karen, Mark had been watching her antics from inside his house. From his window, he observed as she paced around his car, snapping photos and scribbling furiously. At first, he found the situation amusing. Who carried around fake tickets and handed them out like parking enforcement officers? But as he watched her grow increasingly agitated, curiosity got the better of him. Deciding to step outside and see what all the fuss was about, Mark opened his front door and walked toward his car. When Karen saw him approaching, she immediately launched into a tirade. She accused him of ruining the aesthetic of the neighborhood by parking improperly and demanded that he move his car right away. Her tone was sharp, almost shrill, and she gestured wildly with her clipboard, as if trying to emphasize the gravity of the situation. Mark listened patiently, allowing her to vent before calmly explaining that his car wasn't violating any actual laws. He pointed out that it was safely parked within the designated area and posed no threat to anyone. But Karen refused to listen. Instead, she grew more aggressive, insisting that he was disrespecting the HOA bylaws and threatening to call the police if he didn't comply. At this point, Mark couldn't help but chuckle. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his badge, and introduced himself. "Ma'am," he said with a wry smile, "I am the police." For a brief moment, silence hung in the air. Karen stared at the badge, then at Mark, her face pale with shock. She stammered, clearly caught off guard, but quickly recovered by doubling down on her accusations. Rather than backing down, she accused Mark of abusing his position and threatened to file a complaint against him. What started as a harmless misunderstanding was rapidly escalating into something much bigger. Karen's refusal to admit fault only fueled Mark's growing frustration. He tried to reason with her, explaining that her actions, issuing fake tickets and pretending to have legal authority, were not only inappropriate, but potentially illegal. Yet Karen remained defiant, convinced that she was in the right. When she pulled out her phone to record their interaction, loudly accusing Mark of harassment, he realized that this wasn't going to end peacefully. That's when he decided to take matters into his own hands. Reaching for his radio, Mark called dispatch and requested backup. Within minutes, 2 patrol cars arrived, their flashing lights casting colorful reflections on the otherwise serene suburban street. Neighbors began to gather, curious about the commotion. Some recognized Mark while others whispered among themselves, speculating about what could possibly warrant such a dramatic scene. As the officers stepped out of their vehicles, Karen continued to rant and rave, pointing fingers and making wild accusations. But it was clear to everyone present, including the responding officers, that Karen's behavior was anything but rational. With each passing moment, the tension in the air grew thicker. What had started as a minor disagreement over a parked car was now spiraling into a full-blown confrontation. And deep down, Mark knew that Karen's stubbornness and refusal to back down would lead to consequences far greater than she ever anticipated. Karen's obsession with enforcing the HOA rules wasn't just a casual hobby. It was practically her life's mission. She prided herself on being the neighborhood's unofficial guardian, the one who kept everyone in line. To her, every little detail mattered, whether it was ensuring that no one hung laundry outside to dry, against HOA guidelines, or making sure holiday lights were taken down by January 2nd, one day after the official deadline. Karen had an almost fanatical dedication to these rules, and she saw herself as the last line of defense against chaos. In her mind, if she didn't step in, the entire neighborhood would descend into disorder. When Mark parked his car along the curb that afternoon, he had no idea how much trouble it would cause. To him, it was a simple solution to a temporary problem. The construction crew working on his driveway needed space, so parking on the curb seemed like the most logical choice. He didn't think twice about it because, quite frankly, there was nothing wrong with what he'd done. His car wasn't obstructing traffic, it wasn't blocking anyone's driveway or mailbox, and it certainly wasn't violating any city ordinances. But none of that mattered to Karen. All she saw was an opportunity to flex her self-appointed authority. The moment Karen spotted Mark's car, her eyes narrowed and her lips pressed into a thin line. She stormed out of her house, clutching her clipboard, a tool she treated like a weapon, and marched straight toward the offending vehicle. Her movements were sharp and purposeful, as though she were preparing for battle. Without hesitation, she began snapping photos of the car from multiple angles, capturing every possible detail. She scribbled furiously in her notebook, jotting down notes that only she could decipher. Then, with a dramatic flourish, she pulled out one of her pre-printed forms. These forms were something Karen had designed herself, complete with bold lettering. and legal-sounding phrases. They looked official enough to intimidate even the most law-abiding residents. On this particular form, Karen wrote, "Improper parking, fine $500, pay immediately or face further action." She added the date, time, and a description of the alleged offense, signing her name at the bottom with unnecessary flair. Satisfied with her work, she tucked the form under Mark's windshield wiper, ensuring it was visible to anyone passing. To Karen, this wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration of war. She stood back for a moment, arms crossed, glaring at the car as if daring it to defy her further. Meanwhile, Mark had been watching the entire scene unfold from inside his house. From his living room window, he observed Karen circling his car, like a hawk. At first he found it amusing. Who carried around fake tickets and handed them out like they were actual citations? But as he watched her grow increasingly agitated, snapping photos and muttering to herself, curiosity got the better of him. He grabbed his keys and walked outside, ready to see what all the fuss was about. As soon as Karen noticed Mark approaching, she launched into a full-blown tirade. "You can't just park your car wherever you feel like it," she exclaimed, her voice rising with each word. "This is a residential area, not some free-for-all parking lot. Do you have any idea how much your careless behavior affects property values?" Mark raised an eyebrow but remained calm. "Ma'am," he said politely, "my car isn't breaking any laws. It's parked safely within the designated street parking lines, and it's not blocking anyone." But Karen wasn't interested in hearing excuses. She waved her clipboard in the air for emphasis as if it somehow validated her argument. "That doesn't matter," she shot back. "You're violating the HOA bylaws, and those are non-negotiable. If you don't move your car immediately, I'll have no choice but to escalate this." Her tone was shrill, almost hysterical, and her gestures grew more exaggerated with every sentence. Passers-by slowed down to watch the spectacle, exchanging puzzled glances. Some recognized Karen and rolled their eyes, while others whispered, among themselves, wondering what Mark had done to incur her wrath. Mark tried again to reason with her. "Look, I understand you're concerned about the neighborhood," he said, keeping his voice steady. "But my car isn't causing any harm. The driveway is being repaired, so I parked here temporarily. Once the work is done, I'll move it." "Karen," scoffed. "Temporary? Everything needs to be permanent compliance. Rules exist for a reason, and if people like you keep ignoring them, we'll end up living in a dump." At this point, Mark couldn't help but chuckle. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his badge, holding it up for Karen to see. "Ma'am," he said with a small smile, "I am the police." For a split second, Karen froze. Her face went pale, and her mouth opened slightly as if she were trying to process what she'd just heard. Then, almost instantly, her expression shifted from shock to defiance. Instead of apologizing or backing down, she doubled down on her accusations. "Oh, so now you're going to abuse your power?" she spat. "Just because you're a cop doesn't mean you're above the rules." Mark sighed, realizing that reasoning with Karen was futile. He explained patiently that issuing fake tickets and pretending to have legal authority was not only inappropriate, but also potentially illegal. He warned her that her actions could lead to serious consequences. But Karen refused to listen. In fact, she became even more belligerent, pulling out her phone to record their interaction. "This is harassment," she shouted, pointing the camera at Mark. "Everyone should know how officers misuse their authority. You're bullying me because I called you out." By now, a small crowd had gathered. Neighbors peered out of their windows or lingered on the sidewalk, eager to witness the drama unfold. Some recognized Mark and nodded sympathetically, knowing him as a kind and level-headed person. Others exchanged knowing looks, whispering about how Karen always took things too far. Despite the growing audience, Karen showed no signs of calming down. If anything, she grew louder and more aggressive, determined to prove that she was in the right. Realizing that Karen wasn't going to de-escalate the situation, Mark decided to take action. He reached for his radio and contacted dispatch, requesting backup. Within minutes, 2 patrol cars arrived, their flashing lights casting colorful reflections on the otherwise peaceful suburban street. The sight of the police vehicles drew even more attention, and curious neighbors spilled out of their homes to see what was happening. One of the responding officers approached Karen, who immediately launched into another tirade. She accused Mark of harassing her and demanded that the officers arrest him for abusing his position. But when the officer reviewed the fake ticket Karen had issued, it quickly became clear that she was the one in the wrong. Fraudulent documents, impersonating a public official, and attempting to extort money, all of these were serious offenses. When the officers informed Karen that she was under arrest, she screamed and protested, claiming she was being unfairly targeted. As handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Karen continued to rant, insisting that she was the victim in all of this. But the evidence spoke for itself. Several neighbors stepped forward to confirm that Karen had a history of bullying and overstepping her bounds. One woman recounted how Karen had once threatened to fine her for planting yellow flowers instead of white ones, while another shared a story about receiving a formal complaint for leaving a recycling bin out overnight. These testimonies only strengthened the case against Karen. For Mark, the situation was surreal. He never imagined that a simple act of parking his car would spiral into such chaos. Yet, as he watched Karen being led away and handcuffed, he couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication, not just for himself but for everyone else who had ever been subjected to her relentless rule enforcing. The neighborhood returned to its usual tranquility, but the memory of Karen's downfall lingered, serving as a reminder that sometimes karma has a way of restoring balance. And as for Mark, he went back inside his house, shaking his head with a mix of amusement and disbelief. Life in the suburbs, he thought, was rarely boring, but today had been especially unforgettable. As the patrol cars pulled up to the scene, their flashing lights casting a kaleidoscope of red and blue across the neighborhood, Karen's demeanor shifted dramatically. One moment she was yelling at Mark, accusing him of abusing his authority and bullying her for simply trying to uphold the HOA rules. The next, she was frantically scrambling to compose herself as uniformed officers stepped out of their vehicles. Her face flushed with panic, but she quickly masked it with indignation. After all, Karen wasn't about to let anyone, especially not Mark or these officers, see her sweat. The first officer approached cautiously, his expression neutral but professional. He glanced between Mark and Karen, clearly trying to assess the situation before jumping to conclusions. "What's going on here?" he asked calmly, addressing both parties. Mark stepped forward, his tone measured and respectful. "Officer," he began, gesturing toward Karen, "this woman issued me a fake parking ticket claiming I violated HOA rules. She threatened legal action and refused to back down when I explained my car isn't breaking any actual laws. When I identified myself as a police officer, she became aggressive and started recording our interaction while making false accusations." Karen, sensing that the spotlight had turned to her, immediately went on the defensive. "That's not true," she exclaimed, pointing an accusatory finger at Mark. "He's abusing his position because I called him out for improper parking. This is harassment. Everyone should know how cops misuse their power." Her voice carried across the street, drawing even more attention from neighbors who had already gathered. Some stood quietly, observing the unfolding drama, while others whispered among themselves. A few exchanged knowing glances. They'd dealt with Karen's antics before and weren't surprised to see her causing trouble again. The officer turned to Karen, his voice firm but calm. "Ma'am, can you show me the ticket you mentioned?" Without hesitation, Karen reached into her pocket and produced the handwritten form she'd placed under Mark's windshield wiper earlier. She thrust it toward the officer with exaggerated confidence, as if presenting irrefutable evidence of wrongdoing. The officer took the paper and examined it closely. His brow furrowed slightly as he read through the document, which featured bold letters proclaiming improper parking and demanded payment of $500 within 48 hours to avoid further action. Handing the paper back to Karen, the officer asked, "Do you have the authority to issue this kind of citation?" Karen hesitated for a fraction of a second, then blurted out, "Of course I do. I'm enforcing the HOA bylaws. They're legally binding and everyone in this neighborhood knows it." The second officer, who had been listening intently, interjected gently, "Ma'am, HOA bylaws aren't the same as municipal ordinances. You don't have the legal authority to issue fines or citations. Doing so could constitute fraud. Karen's eyes widened and she sputtered. But I'm protecting the neighborhood. Someone has to make sure people follow the rules. At this point, Mark decided to step in. He addressed the officers directly, explaining, "She also claimed she'd call the police if I didn't comply. When I showed her my badge, she accused me of abusing my position and started recording us, making baseless accusations. She wouldn't stop escalating the situation." The officers exchanged a glance, silently communicating their assessment of the matter. One of them turned to Karen. "Ma'am, based on what we've seen and heard so far, it seems you may have impersonated a public official and attempted to extort money through fraudulent means. We'll need to investigate further." Karen's face drained of color. For the first time since the confrontation began, she looked genuinely rattled. No, she stammered. "You don't understand. I'm just doing my job as a concerned citizen. He's twisting everything around." Her protest grew louder and more desperate, drawing even more curious onlookers. Some of the neighbors shook their heads in disbelief, while others seemed almost gleeful at the sight of Karen being taken down a peg. One elderly man leaned over to his wife and muttered, "Good riddance. Maybe now we'll finally get some peace around here." Meanwhile, the officers continued questioning Karen, asking for clarification on her intentions and actions. As they pressed her for answers, cracks began to show in her carefully constructed facade. Her responses became increasingly erratic, shifting from defiant denials to vague justifications. At one point, she even tried to play the victim, insisting that Mark and the officers were ganging up on her unfairly. Sensing an opportunity to clarify things further, Mark spoke up again. "If it helps," he said, addressing the officers, "I can provide context. She's done similar things to other neighbors in the past. People have complained about her aggressive behavior and attempts to enforce non-existent penalties." This revelation prompted several neighbors to step forward. One woman recounted how Karen had once sent her a strongly worded letter, demanding she repaint her mailbox because it didn't match the approved color palette. Another neighbor described receiving a formal complaint after accidentally leaving a trash bin out overnight. Each story painted a clearer picture of Karen's pattern of behavior, a relentless pursuit of control disguised as concern for the community. Listening to these accounts, the officers nodded thoughtfully. They thanked the neighbors for their input and assured them that the situation would be handled appropriately. Turning back to Karen, they informed her that she was under arrest for impersonating a public official, issuing fraudulent documents, and attempting extortion. As they recited her rights, Karen exploded into a tirade, screaming and flailing her arms. "This is outrageous," she shouted, her voice shrill and trembling. "I'm the victim here. Arrest him, not me. He's the one breaking the rules." Despite her protests, the officers remained calm and professional. They guided her toward one of the patrol cars where she continued to rant and rave, refusing to cooperate. It took considerable effort to secure her in the back seat, and even then she pressed her face against the window, shouting obscenities and pointing fingers at Mark and the assembled crowd. As the patrol car drove away, the neighborhood fell silent for a moment. Then, slowly, murmurs of relief and satisfaction rippled through the group. Some residents clapped softly, while others chuckled under their breath. One young mother summed up the collective sentiment perfectly. Finally, someone stood up to her. Thank goodness for Mark, the entire ordeal felt surreal. He had gone from simply wanting to park his car during driveway repairs to becoming the central figure in a bizarre confrontation that ended with Karen being arrested. While part of him felt sorry for her, after all, nobody deserved to be publicly humiliated like that. He couldn't deny the sense of vindication washing over him. Not only had he defended himself, but he had also exposed Karen's toxic behavior for what it truly was. As the crowd dispersed and the flashing lights faded into the distance, Mark returned to his house, still processing everything that had happened. He sat down on his couch, letting out a long sigh. Life in the suburbs, he mused, was supposed to be peaceful and predictable. But sometimes, The most unexpected moments reminded him why he loved his job, and why staying calm and level-headed, even in absurd situations, always paid off. Outside, the neighborhood buzzed with conversation. Neighbors who had once dreaded crossing paths with Karen now exchanged stories and shared laughter, united by the shared experience of watching her downfall. And though the memory of the incident would linger for weeks to come, one thing was certain: Karen's reign of terror had finally come to an end. The arrest of Karen Miller sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, and within hours the story had spread like wildfire. What started as a minor disagreement over a parked car had spiraled into something far bigger, a public reckoning that exposed years of pent-up frustration among residents. For many, it was a moment of vindication. Karen's reign of terror over the HOA rules had finally come to an end, and people couldn't stop talking about it. As news of her arrest circulated, the reactions varied widely. Some neighbors were relieved, others amused, and a few even felt a twinge of sympathy for Karen, though not enough to defend her actions. Conversations buzzed at mailboxes, during morning walks, and in backyard chats. Everyone had their own version of the story, but one thing remained consistent. Karen's behavior had long been a source of tension in the community, and her downfall was almost poetic justice. The aftermath. The next day, life in the neighborhood seemed quieter than usual, but beneath the surface, emotions were running high. Several residents approached Mark to thank him for standing up to Karen. "You've done us all a favor," said Mrs. Harper, an elderly woman who lived 2 doors down. She recounted how Karen had once threatened to fine her for leaving a garden hose coiled outside overnight. "I didn't sleep for days after she sent me that letter," Mrs. Harper admitted. "It's such a relief to know she won't be breathing down our necks anymore." Mark listened patiently, nodding as neighbor after neighbor shared their grievances. He hadn't realized just how widespread Karen's influence, or rather, intimidation, had been. It wasn't just about enforcing trivial rules. It was the way she made people feel small, powerless, and constantly on edge. Her tactics had created an atmosphere of fear, where even the smallest mistake could result in a scathing email or a formal complaint filed with the HOA board. Despite the gratitude he received, Mark felt conflicted. On one hand, he understood why people were celebrating Karen's arrest. On the other hand, he knew firsthand what it meant to enforce laws, not personal vendettas, and he couldn't help but feel a pang of empathy for her. Arresting someone wasn't something he took lightly, even if they deserved it. Still, he reminded himself that Karen's actions had crossed a line. Impersonating a public official, issuing fake tickets, and attempting extortion weren't harmless quirks. They were serious offenses that warranted consequences. The HOA board steps in. The days following Karen's arrest, the HOA board held an emergency meeting to address the fallout. They issued a formal apology to Mark, acknowledging that his rights had been violated and assuring him that steps would be taken to prevent similar incidents in the future. The letter was polite and professional, signed by all members of the board. But what caught everyone's attention was the second part of their statement, a pledge to review and reform the HOA's enforcement policies. "We recognize that some individuals may have overstepped their roles in enforcing our guidelines," the statement read. "Moving forward, we will implement stricter oversight to ensure fairness and accountability within our community." This announcement came as a surprise to many residents, especially those who had grown accustomed to Karen's heavy-handed approach. Some wondered whether the board had turned a blind eye to her antics in the past, while others speculated that the recent incident had forced them to confront issues they'd previously ignored. Regardless of the reasons behind it, the decision to overhaul the system was met with cautious optimism. One neighbor, Mr. Patel, summed up the general sentiment. "It's about time they cleaned house. We pay dues to live here, not to be bullied. Into submission." Karen's legal troubles escalate. Meanwhile, Karen found herself facing mounting legal challenges. The charges against her included impersonating a public official, fraud, and attempted extortion. Each offense carried significant penalties, and combined, they painted a damning picture of her actions. During her court appearance, Karen appeared subdued, a stark contrast to the fiery demeanor she'd displayed during the confrontation with Mark. Gone was the clipboard-wielding enforcer who strutted around the neighborhood. In her place stood a woman visibly shaken by the weight of her circumstances. Her defense attorney argued that Karen's intentions were good, albeit misguided. "My client believed she was acting in the best interest of her community," the lawyer stated. "While her methods may have been inappropriate, there was no malicious intent." But the prosecution countered that ignorance of the law was no excuse. They presented evidence of the fake ticket Karen had issued to Mark, along with testimonies from neighbors who had suffered under her rule. One particularly damning piece of evidence came from a former HOA board member, who revealed that Karen had pressured them into filing frivolous complaints against residents who dared to question her authority. When it came time for sentencing, the judge delivered a stern verdict. Karen was fined thousands of dollars and ordered to attend anger management classes. Additionally, she was banned from serving in any capacity related to the HOA, a ruling that drew applause from the courtroom gallery, which included several of her former victims. A community transformed. Back in the neighborhood, life began to change in subtle yet meaningful ways. Without Karen patrolling the streets, residents noticed a newfound sense of freedom. People started planting flowers in colors outside the approved palette, hanging wind chimes on their porches and leaving bicycles parked in driveways without fear of retribution. These small acts of rebellion might have seemed insignificant to outsiders, but to the residents they symbolized liberation. The HOA board followed through on its promise to reform its policies, introducing clearer guidelines and establishing a mediation process for resolving disputes. Instead of relying on self-appointed enforcers like Karen, the board encouraged open communication and mutual respect among neighbors. Monthly meetings became opportunities for residents to voice concerns and share ideas, fostering a stronger sense of community. For Mark, the experience reinforced his belief in the importance of staying calm and composed, even in absurd situations. He continued living his quiet life, enjoying the peace and camaraderie of his neighborhood. But every now and then, as he passed Karen's empty driveway, he couldn't help but smile. The memory of her arrest served as a reminder that sometimes standing up for what's right can lead to unexpected and satisfying results. Reflections on justice and karma. As weeks turned into months, the incident became a part of local lore. Neighbors joked about it during barbecues and holiday gatherings, often referring to Karen as the woman who tried to fine a cop. For many, it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting ego override common sense. Karen's downfall proved that no matter how much power someone thinks they wield, there are always consequences for abusing it. In the end, the neighborhood emerged stronger and more united than ever. The ordeal had brought people together, giving them a chance to reflect on what truly mattered: kindness, understanding, and respect. And while Karen's absence left a void, it also opened the door for a brighter, more harmonious chapter in the community's history. For Mark, the lesson was simple: sometimes karma wears a badge. The weeks following Karen's arrest brought a noticeable shift in the neighborhood. It wasn't just the absence of her clipboard-wielding presence that made the difference. It was the collective sigh of relief from residents who had spent years walking on eggshells. Life slowed down to its natural rhythm again, and for the first time in a long while, the community felt like a place where people could truly relax and enjoy their homes without fear of judgment or retaliation. Mark noticed the change almost immediately. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact with him now greeted him warmly, often stopping to chat about how much better things felt since Karen's departure. Some even joked about renaming the street Officer Reynolds Way in his honor, though Mark laughed it off, insisting he'd only done what anyone else would have done in his position. But deep down, he appreciated the gratitude. It reminded him that standing up for what's right, even when it feels awkward or inconvenient, can make a real impact. A newfound sense of freedom. Without Karen lurking around every corner, residents began testing the boundaries of the HOA rules. not out of defiance, but simply because they wanted to reclaim their autonomy. Mrs. Harper planted bright yellow marigolds along her front walkway, a color strictly forbidden by the old guidelines. Mr. Patel installed solar-powered string lights above his garage, something Karen had once deemed visually disruptive. And young families started leaving strollers and toys scattered across driveways, no longer worried about receiving sternly worded letters demanding compliance. These small acts of rebellion weren't meant to provoke. Rather, they symbolized a newfound sense of freedom. People took pride in personalizing their spaces, adding touches that reflected their personalities instead of adhering rigidly to a sterile set of standards. The neighborhood still looked beautiful, but now it felt alive, with character and charm replacing uniformity. Even the HOA board embraced this shift. Their reforms proved effective, encouraging collaboration over enforcement. Monthly meetings became less formal and more inclusive, with residents invited to share ideas and concerns openly. For example, one suggestion led to the creation of a community garden where neighbors could grow vegetables and flowers together. Another proposal resulted in organizing weekend cleanup events, fostering teamwork and camaraderie. Slowly but surely, the focus shifted from policing minor infractions to building connections and strengthening relationships. Karma wears a badge. As the months passed, the story of Karen's downfall continued to circulate, becoming a staple of local gossip. At barbecues, holiday parties, and casual porch conversations, neighbors recounted the tale with a mix of humor and admiration for Mark's calm handling of the situation. Many referred to it as the day karma caught up with Karen, marveling at how fate had intervened in such an unexpected way. For Mark, these retellings were both amusing and humbling. He never sought recognition for what happened, but he couldn't deny the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served. In HOA, his line of work, he saw countless examples of people abusing power or letting ego cloud their judgment. Karen's case was unique only in its absurdity, a reminder that sometimes the most dramatic confrontations stem from the smallest issues. Reflecting on the incident, Mark realized that it offered valuable lessons not just for Karen, but for everyone involved. First and foremost, it highlighted the importance of perspective. While rules and guidelines are necessary for maintaining order, they shouldn't overshadow compassion and understanding. Communities thrive when people prioritize kindness over control, working together to create environments where everyone feels valued and respected. Secondly, the ordeal underscored the dangers of taking oneself too seriously. Karen's obsession with enforcing trivial rules stemmed from a desire for perfection, but in her quest for order, she lost sight of what truly mattered: human connection. Her downfall served as a cautionary tale about the consequences of letting pride and rigidity dictate one's actions. Lessons learned, and shared word of Karen's arrest eventually spread beyond the neighborhood, thanks in part to social media. Someone posted a lighthearted recap of the incident online, complete with photos of the fake ticket and screenshots of Karen's dramatic behavior during the confrontation. The post went viral, sparking discussions about the fine line between enforcing rules and overstepping boundaries. Commenters chimed in with their own stories of HOA bullies, sharing tips on how to handle similar situations. Mark found himself amused and slightly embarrassed by the attention. Friends from other parts of town texted him links to articles and memes inspired by the story. One particularly popular meme featured a cartoon cop holding up a badge with the caption, "When you think you're enforcing the law but end up getting arrested instead." Despite the humor, Mark recognized that the story resonated with so many people because it touched on universal themes: fairness, accountability, and the importance of humility. Inspired by the response, Mark decided to use the platform to promote positive change. During a community meeting, he encouraged residents to focus on creating a supportive environment where disagreements could be resolved peacefully. "Conflict is inevitable," he said, addressing the group. "But how we handle it defines us as individuals and as a community." His words struck a chord with those present, Several neighbors volunteered to serve on a new committee dedicated to fostering open communication and resolving disputes amicably. Others pledged to reach out to newcomers, ensuring they felt welcomed and included. Together, they worked to transform the neighborhood into a model of cooperation and mutual respect. A happier ending for everyone else. While the neighborhood flourished, Karen struggled to rebuild her life after her legal troubles. The financial penalties and mandatory classes left her drained, both emotionally and financially. Unable to face the stares and whispers of her former neighbors, she quietly put her house on the market and moved to a smaller town miles away. Though some residents felt a pang of sympathy for her isolation, most agreed that her departure marked the beginning of a brighter chapter for everyone else. In her absence, the neighborhood blossomed. Children played freely in cul-de-sacs. Laughter echoed through backyards, and front porches became gathering spots for evening chats. Even the aesthetic of the area improved, not because of stricter rules, but because residents took genuine pride in their surroundings. The community garden thrived, producing fresh produce that neighbors shared generously. Holiday decorations returned with gusto, lighting up streets with warmth and cheer. For Mark, the transformation was deeply rewarding. He hadn't set out to become a hero, but seeing the positive changes unfold reinforced his belief in the power of integrity and patience. Whether on duty or off, he knew that leading by example could inspire others to do the same. Closing thoughts. Looking back, Mark often thought about how quickly a simple act of parking his car had spiraled into something far greater. The experience taught him and everyone else that life is full of surprises, and sometimes standing your ground can lead to outcomes you never anticipated. It also reminded him that communities are built not on rigid rules, but on trust, empathy, and shared values. As he sat on his porch one evening watching the sun dip below the horizon, Mark smiled. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, and vibrant, a testament to the resilience of its residents. Somewhere in the distance, a child's laugh rang out, followed by the gentle hum of conversation. For Mark, it was the sound of harmony restored. And, though Karen's empty driveway remained a permanent reminder of the chaos she once caused, it also stood as a symbol of hope. Proof that even in the most unlikely places, balance could be restored, and karma sometimes wore a badge.